following very popular session using Socratic dialogue and questioning in the classroom will be presented by Reverend Steve Cholak, pastor at our Savior Lutheran Church in Houston, Texas. Please welcome Reverend Cholak.
Well, good afternoon. I think the way I'd like to do this is I'm going to talk a little bit, read a little bit. We're going to look at a Platonic dialogue specifically, but then I want to reserve a good portion of time to actually talk about Socratic dialogue at the various levels and maybe have my thoughts on the different levels and how that can be implemented, and also then get some of your thoughts, because all of you in the midst of the classroom have experiences on some of the things that are wonderful and work, and we can meld our resources together. Before I start, I should say that, and I've probably mentioned this a couple of times as we talk, but the life of a classical Lutheran educator is one that means that you are educating yourself. And to that end, part of that is recommending books to you. So you should all be readers, avid readers, trying to hone your skills. And I think there's like a tension here, because a teacher is sort of stuck in this spot where he is the one to lead the scholars, the children under him, but he is also a scholar of the subject matter which he's trying to lead them to. And perhaps we could sort of distance ourselves a little bit from the idea that a educator is one who has all of the answers and is just trying to take all of that information that's in my brain and now put it in all of yours. There's a couple of places where we hear analogies like the fact that an educator is more like a midwife who's leading someone to the ultimate end, doesn't actually do the work, and therefore is a helper in that sense, a cooperator. Let me just share some books that have been very instrumental to me, and especially if you're just starting a classical school from the ground up, or you're in the process of transitioning to a classical curriculum and program and idea. The first one I'd say that's been very instrumental to me is called the Liberal Arts Tradition. Of course, the very first one you should read is Dr. Veith's book, so that you have a nice understanding of that movement that's sweeping the nation, and you understand part of that introductory stuff to do your elevator speech, right? This book here is called The Liberal Arts Tradition by Kevin Clark and Ravi Scott Jane. This has some really good stuff. This is in its third edition, and some really nice additional stuff at the end of the book. Okay? This is going to talk piety, gymnasia, the liberal arts, sciences, and those kind of things, which are very, very important. Another one that's sort of just out there to all classical educators, not just Lutherans, Wisdom and Eloquence. If any of you have read this one. This one's written by Littlejohn and Evans. And I like this, not any more or less than the liberal arts tradition, but this sort of gets to some of the philosophy of what's going on and the inner workings. This one, for us Lutherans, Thomas Korczak's book, Lutheran Education. This is a great one for us too. Okay, now to the subject matter at hand. This book just came out from Classical Academic Press not too long ago, called Socratic Conversation. And this is by a guy named Jeffrey Lehman. I don't know him personally, but I do know some people who have had him in class. He used to teach at Hillsdale. And so this was a great text as we were looking through these kind of things. Just recently, I've been reading a little bit, and this may change your thoughts about some things, but I like adding some stuff, but looking at Mortimer Adler's conversation about the Paideia proposal. If any of you have ever seen any of that, probably I think my favorite title of any of the books that Mortimer Adler wrote is called How to Read a Book, and very good text. He was the guy who led the great books of the Western world movement from Encyclopedia Britannica. So, but
He wrote a sequel called How to Read Two Books.
How to Listen, I think, is also one too that we're connected. So, and that's probably something that we're going to end up talking a lot about, is the art of listening, which is essential to Socratic dialogue. Okay. But he was also chairman of what was called the Paideia Group, and they published a book in the 1980s called the Paideia Proposal, a manifesto for educational reform. And his idea was to completely reform basic schooling, as he called it, government schooling in America. But there's some really interesting things about what he calls seminar, what you and I are going to call Socratic dialogue. So that might come up here. He wrote also, or at least there's a conglomeration of essays that he wrote called Reforming Education. And I'm going to start by quoting Mortimer Adler. On the topic of great books and education reform in America, he once said, "The great books cannot make students think. Thinking is hard. It is probably one of the most painful things that human beings are ever called upon to do." End quote. So it is that we lead our students into the midst of the fountain and bid them drink deep, all the while knowing it's going to be painful. It's going to take effort. The teacher, therefore, must be ready to adjust to the situation, and the students as they engage in this process of thinking. And they're doing this process with you. You're teaching the students how to take up the mantle of enduring heritage. The noble things indeed are difficult, ladies and gentlemen. Thinking is noble. Thinking is difficult. According to Adler, this process includes 3 arenas. Students need to know what, they need to know how, and they need to know why. And I found that kind of interesting to ponder. As a lifelong learner, as each of us should be, that we keep looking at our own teaching styles and our own way of doing it. Not that we are working to change any particular thing about it, but that we are continuing to be learners about the very craft or the art that we claim to be masters of. A teacher can accomplish these 3 in many different ways. And as you know, that morphs and changes in your classrooms or living rooms, in your homes, a lot, right? There is a baseline, but there's some way that this morphs often. Sometimes you lecture, sometimes you coach or you tutor, sometimes you lead discussion. So the ultimate wrestling with the topic and the understanding of a reading comes in the open discussion and the dialogue that a class can go through after they have encountered a piece of art or read a selection. In this little text by Edward Kaler, A Christian Pedagogy, if you say it that way. This was published by Concordia Publishing House in 1930. These 3 particular areas were presented as, if I can do there, lecture, tutoring, and dialogue. So you get sort of the same kind of terminologies there. And then this one by Gilbert Hyatt, The Art of Teaching. This copy apparently was $1.25 at some point. They use similar terms. Let's see. A teacher is lecturing, tutoring, and reciting. And the recitation includes examinations, questions and discussion, competition, the uses of tradition, and punishment, which is a chapter I'd love to read. So Littlejohn and Evans in Wisdom and Eloquence says this in their wonderful little book. quote, if education is truly a preparation for life, then all the most important ideas that determine the quality of life must be discussed regularly. We must not waste our students' time with irrelevant trivia. The Christian classroom should resound with conversations and questions about faith, hope, and love. Truth, goodness, and beauty should find expression in every aspect of the curriculum. End quote. Of course, the devil, the world, and our sinful flesh are happy to close down that conversation. But our Lord Christ and the Holy Spirit are not. It is imperative that our students, as they work towards being wise unto salvation, become comfortable discussing topics, understanding multiple sides of an argument, and patiently discussing and examining the topic. I think this is most important because we are sort of stuck in the culture of the doom scroll, right? And we have, at least from my observations, we have a society that has no patience for a conversation or patience to listen and to wait things out, to actually bring it all into your mind and into your heart. And if there is a silence in that time, as someone else was talking, it's often not used as listening time, but what am I going to say when it's my turn again, right? To jump back in and to miss out on half of the conversation that's going on. And so part of your duty, part of our duty is to teach, as I called it, the scholasticus, the virtuous habits of the Christian life, right? And one of those is to be listening and to be able to have a discussion for the sake of the discussion, and not immediately, as our society does, get upset at one another and stomp off and go to ad hominem attacks instead. The lovers of wisdom have been after this understanding for a millennium. We see examples of this dialogue and seminar discussion in Plato's dialogues with the master of this kind of dialogue, Socrates himself. Thus, it has stood the test of time and bears his name for us. Plato was a cultivator of virtue. He formulates 4 cardinal virtues in order to map the human soul. In the Republic, Socrates says this, quote, if then we adhere to our original notion and bear in mind that our guardians, setting aside every other business, are to dedicate themselves wholly to the maintenance of freedom in the state, making this their craft, and engaging in no work which does not bear on this end, they ought not to practice or imitate anything else. If they imitate at all, it should imitate from youth upward only those characters which are suitable to their profession, the courageous, temperate, holy, free, and the like. But they should not depict or be skillful in imitating any kind of illiberality or baseness, lest from imitation they should come to be what they imitate. Do any of you listen to any of the Circe podcasts? Circe Institute's podcast, yeah. There's a new one that just came out where Joshua Gibbs is leading. I believe it's called In the Trenches. And at the end of every one of his episodes, he says, your students will imitate you. You must imitate God. And to this point here, as Socrates didn't know this particular thing, but here we go. Here Plato's pulling out courage, temperance, piety, and justice or freedom. This is all being done in the Republic, but we see even in earlier works evidence of this in early Socrates, particularly in, I always say, Euthyphro. If you have a quibble with my pronunciation, please talk to me about it. Socrates wants to know what virtue is. This dialogue concerns itself with what is holy and what is unholy. This dialogue sets the stage for a common occurrence in Socratic dialogue. The interlocutor gives an example instead of a definition. How many times has this happened to you in class? You ask for a definition and you get an example instead. What's fire? What's that thing that I put the marshmallows on? Socrates was more interested in the idea of holiness instead of examples of it. The idea here reminded me of essence. Socrates is trying to get to the essence of what holiness is instead of the substance of it. Let's look at the text. Socrates. Good heavens, Euthyphro. And is your knowledge of religion and of things pious and impious so very exact, that supposing the circumstances to be as you state them, you are not afraid lest you too may be doing an impious thing in bringing an action against your father? Euthyphro, the best of Euthyphro, and that which distinguishes him, Socrates, from other men, is his exact knowledge of all such matters. What should I be good for without it? Where, friend, I think that I cannot do better than be your disciple. Then, before the trial with Meletus comes on, I shall challenge him, and say that I have always had a great interest in religious questions, and now as he charges me with rash imaginations and innovations in religion, I have become your disciple. You, Meletus, as I shall say to him, acknowledge Euthyphro to be a great theologian and sound in his opinions, and if you approve of him, you ought to approve of me, and not have me in court. But if you disapprove, you should begin by indicting him who is my teacher, and who will be the ruin not of the young but of the old. That is to say, of myself whom he instructs, and of his old father whom he admonishes and chastises. And if Meletus refuses to listen to me, but will go on, and will not shift the indictment from me to you, I cannot do better than repeat this challenge in the court. The theory of forms suggests that the physical world is not as real as the forms. The emphasis is on the essence, not necessarily on the thing itself. For Plato, there is something enduring and lasting about holiness that cannot be seen, but that can be known. So there are 5 concepts. We'll move through each and see examples from the dialogues perhaps as we go, and examples from you, if you will. First, it proceeds by question and answer. Now, I want to talk about this first. This is way too large of a group to do Socratic dialogue. Okay. We want to be able to have a conversation, and I want to be careful to say that the one who is the leader of Socratic dialogue is the one who is, like I said, a midwife, is not taking the business of the work, but is leading the group through the work, okay? And so never does the teacher, when you're actually engaged in a Socratic dialogue, actually didactically lecture to them. However, you do want to keep them in the conversation and keep them on the topic. And so to that note, we were just talking before we started. If a question is posed and an answer comes that has nothing to do with the point of the discussion or the book or the source or whatever it is that you're teaching, that's not a question that's okay. Okay, you need, as the leader, to pull them back. So to say that there are no inappropriate questions or there are no wrong questions or answers, there are no wrong answers, that's not the case in Socratic dialogue. It needs to be part of the conversation. And I am famous with my youth group to go on tangents all the time. And so we even up and down through rabbit holes all the time. And that's not what you do in a Socratic dialogue, okay? So, but first, we want to proceed by question and answer. That's easy enough. This is what every teacher's mind first contemplates when he decides he will engage in Socratic method in the classroom. When you think of it, when you remember back to your times of reading Plato, reading the Republic, reading whatever it is that you've read, you think of, oh yeah, there's that Socrates who kept asking questions, right? You give an answer and then you weave it back into a new question. You're like, wait a minute, how did I get into this mess, right? And sometimes you get really contentious moments, like in Mequon, you get, oh, go ahead with me. What? Jump? Maybe? Maybe I should not get ahead of myself. Here's Mequon, play this Mequon. You have this moment where Mequon wants to know if virtue can be taught or if it comes to man by nature or in some other way. And Socrates' answer to Mequon is, I don't even know what virtue is. So I can't answer your question, right? And Mequon answers, Are you in earnest, Socrates, in saying that you do not know what virtue is, and I am to carry back this report of you to Thessaly? Not only that, my dear boy, Socrates responds, but you may say further that I have never known of anyone else who did in my judgment. Meno says, well, then you've never met Gorgias when he was in Athens. Socrates says, well, yes, I have. And did you not think that he knew? I have not a good memory, Socrates says, Meno, and therefore I cannot tell what I thought of him at the time. And I dare say that he did know, and that you know what he said. Please, therefore, to remind me of what he said, or if you would rather tell me your own view, for I suspect that you and he think much alike. It's very true. Okay, so you get sort of caught in this, right? This is what we think of when we think Socratic dialogue, question and answer. Okay. This, the problem is, what question do you ask first? And who will I ask? How should they be phrased? What are we talking about? Should we include any of the pleasantries of small talk and introductions? And I would also say that, like to my comment earlier, that you need to have a smaller group for Socratic dialogue. When you're engaged in Socratic dialogue, you should be engaging the entirety of the group. Okay, and part of that leadership role is to draw all of those scholars into the conversation and keep them in the exercise. Okay. Leaving aside the pleasantries of small talk and introductions. So, for instance, in Euthyphro, Socrates asks, tell me then, what is the pious and what is the impious, do you say? A good deal of time is then spent on the nuances of that question. As the conversation goes, another book that you should read is by a guy named Ward Farnsworth, called Socratic Conversations, I believe. Does anybody know if I put that title wrong?
Socratic method.
The Socratic Method by Ward Farnsworth. Thank you. Great text. Farnsworth reminds us that Socrates makes sure his interlocutor agrees with every step he takes. And thus, in the dialogues, you hear Socrates coming back again. Isn't that so? Wouldn't you agree? And keeping pulling everybody into the conversation. Would they? Like, let's think about that. Oftentimes I use, you guys all agree with that? Should we allow that answer to stand? Okay. It is almost like Socrates is intentionally training his interlocutor to verbally nod along the conversation. And you see this sometimes in Meno, where you just get these, like, I should. I think not. I did say so. Like, well, absolutely, yeah. You're right, Socrates. Okay. But keeping everybody on the straight and narrow. And when a question is answered, then the human mind gives up and moves on to the next thing. And that's that problem that I was talking about, right? As soon as you hear, even we have this problem, and that's what we were mentioning before. When you hear the question, you're immediately on to your own answer instead of the actual conversation that's at hand, right? And the people who are supposed to be listened to in front of you. We are most engaged in the midst of the question itself. And I think that's part of the brilliance of the wonder of the Socratic dialogue, and that we drill into the conversation with more questions. And that when we are engaged in the dialogue, then we are honed, right? So the Socratic method must take some getting used to, okay? And when the first time you try to do this, it will probably fail miserably. If you've never done it before, it is quite the experience, okay? But it's intriguing, and it is a curiosity that pulls you in. And every time I do it, I want to do it more. And I think to myself, should I do it? And we can talk about this a little bit later too, but should I do it as part of every class? So should there be a lecturing component, a coaching component, or a tutoring component, and a Socratic component to every single day? Or should I make them separate days and get involved in that way? Quick comment. I don't want to lose.
Yes, so you talk about you want to engage the whole classroom. Are there times though when you just want to work with one student maybe or one scholar so that you maintain a thought rather than going down other rabbit holes?
Yeah, and in this sense, I think Meno is a great example, or some of the other dialogues where Socrates is going back and forth with one particular person while there's an obvious crowd around them, right? And then almost out of the blue, and it kind of makes you jump in your seat when you're reading it, some other interlocutor shows up and you're like, where's he come from? But he's been listening the whole time and sort of gotten them in there. And I think maybe this is maybe a tangent, but important note. And that is, as we started off saying, thinking is hard. It is part of the job of the teacher to coach his students to be in the conversation, right? This really came to me from a comment that Nathaniel Holman's pastor gave at a conference. Pastor David Peterson, who's pastor at Redeemer Fort Wayne, he was giving a talk about sermons, and he said in there that the main onus of the preaching is obviously on the preacher, but it's not entirely on the preacher. The people who are listening to the sermon owe a debt of work or a specific amount of effort to actually force themselves to listen to the sermon and to take parts from it, right? And we just had a youth retreat and had some high schoolers ask how. This was unconnected. I didn't lead them on or lead the witness or anything. They said, what can I do to train myself to listen to sermons better, right? Well, you and I should be working to train our students to listen to the conversation and the Socratic dialogue, or the tutoring, or whatever we would call it, the coaching, or most specifically the dialogue, the didactic teaching that we're so, I think, used to, right? When we think of teaching, we think exactly what I'm doing right now. You're all quiet, I'm going to talk, and then the bell will ring and you'll all get up and think, right? And that's only one component of really what you and I have experienced in the classroom, right? Okay? So, teaching yourself to think in questions, I think, is the hardest part. Do you like how I did that? Think in questions is the hardest part, I think. Yeah. That naturally leaves one to uncertainty. One question leads to another, which leads to another. The more you are in the Socratic method, the more you will think in questions and even start formulating your next question before the answer has been given for the first. This kind of labyrinth of questions. Now be careful about that though. This kind of labyrinth of questions and answers has the potential to not end. One day I was teaching 8th grade religion last school year, and I asked the question, what is love? And I got a nice answer to the question of what is love, and my mind immediately went to what's the opposite of love? And I thought to myself, oh, this group remembers the lecture I gave about a month ago about love and hate. And the realm of the divine and the realm of evil, right? And we were looking at that, or even the context of the fruit of the heart, of the flesh, and the fruit of the spirit, right? The difference between those two. I think I heard this right. Anyway. And I said, what's the opposite of love? And I got envy instead of hate. And I went, my brain went, whoa, nope, that's not where I wanted it to be, right? That's not the question I had. So then I immediately went, well, let's define envy. What other words are like envy? Where does envy show up in the scriptures that would give us an idea of things that might be similar to envy? And so we then jumped into the fruit of the flesh and saw some of those things. But thinking in one question leads to another question. So now we're thinking in questions with our mode in mind of leading and encouraging the class through a discussion that's starting to pick apart what they've already read, what they've already experienced. Maybe they've only experienced it once. Maybe this is their 5th time through it. Sometimes you don't know what they've done before they've gotten there. And now we're trying to get down to the why, the understanding. And these questions are really meant to pull the pedals off and get down to the middle. Okay? This process forces you to know your own position better and better, which means you need to have this conversation with yourself before there are students in your room. And this is part of the onus that's put on you as educators to continue to be lifelong learners. You're not only learning your subject matter at hand, but you're also learning how to do this kind of thing better so that you really can get to the understanding rather than just let's memorize something for a test that we can scribble down and move on. If that's ever what we. Okay. Formulating questions and anticipating answers puts your own opinions and beliefs to work for you. Farnsworth says, quote, "The Socratic method doesn't replace your current opinions with better ones. It changes your relationship to opinions. It replaces the love of holding them with the love of testing them." End quote. Notice how the Socratic method forces you to know yourself and your positions better. In the midst of the dialogue, you have to have your whole self available for the conversation. Because you can't hold back any of you, right? We were just having in Scholasticus a conversation about virtue, the moral virtues versus the intellectual virtues, and then the place of truth, goodness, and beauty. How do we, as Christians, talk about truth, goodness, and beauty in light of virtue? And we went through it and these kind of things. I had to look at those terms beforehand. Coming in cold wouldn't have been fair to them or to me as we were going about that work. While doing research for you all, I forced myself to at least conduct a portion of every class I taught in Socratic dialogue for a quarter. Okay, towards the end of the equivalency of a quarter towards the end of last school year. To varying degrees of success, but always exciting about it, right? I was most shocked by the unexpected answers and the different journeys we took because of the unexpected. And that's really one of the fun parts. You know, another point on this is there are objections to this kind of work because one of those things being, here's a whole bunch of people who don't know anything about the text. All talking about the text is the word against it, right? And yet we fail to understand that it's really not an ultimate or a totality of misunderstanding or lack of understanding by everybody at the table. Everybody has different levels of understanding and different amounts of contribution on that text, especially depending on those who have read it once versus 5 or 10 times, right? And so you may have a specific part of it that really made sense to you, and another part that didn't make sense. But another person may have that flat, and in that conversation, that you're going to find those spots. Okay. The questions offer tension that make you refine your answers. Sometimes I'd say, well, we really need to define that word. Or should we let that word stand or should we replace it with another one? What made you think that was the way we should go with this answer? Okay, some of those kind of questions still lead and to sort of encourage towards a particular way. I was reminded that President Lincoln packed his cabinet with rivals, at least the story goes this. He intentionally picked people who would cause him to be on his top game and that he knew that he could lead. Or maybe a more closer analogy for you and me is Luther saying that the reason he was such a good theologian was because of Leo, the Pope. If it hadn't been for Leo and for the devil, he would not have turned out to be the theologian he was. And so it is that this tension that you and I have with the text that we're teaching and the content that we want to make our own so that we can lead these discussions really refines us. And then the actual experience of doing it you guys would all give me different answers that would help in a particular text that would be different than younger kids or so forth. Okay. Socrates is always focused on the consistency of his partners, too, which is interesting. Socrates is consistent in his presentation. He's not going to let the thing meander, right? He begins with internal critique. Socrates wants to pull your beliefs out of you instead of imposing his own upon you, whether you continue to remain consistent with your own beliefs. The truth is that the most important thing for Socrates, he starts with the truth, searches for it, and then doesn't let you go. Okay, no matter what. Now, Socratic dialogue is something that I think, and I would encourage, can be done in any classroom at any age. Okay, and I really do think it needs to be paired with the experience of the what, the how, and the why. Okay, and perhaps we see some of that in the way in which most of us teach or at least import the ideas of the trivium into our classical curriculum space. That there is the what, the grammar of it, the how, the logic of it, and then the why, the rhetoric of it. That we would be able to take it up and to manipulate and use it, right? To tear it apart and see the basic parts. Well, how do you do this with kindergartners? How do you do this with second graders? How different is a second grade Socratic dialogue to a 12th grade Socratic dialogue? How well would it go to be able to set up small groups of Socratic dialogue where you're just sort of moving around the room? In other words, teaching your students to lead smaller circles of dialogue. And so those are all things that I think are important. But first of all, the number one thing which we've mentioned already is that we need to make sure that we're teaching our students how to listen. And that might be, I think, to me, one of those focus areas on what I'm coaching my students or my scholars to do, so that you're learning how, whether that be to take notes, when to take notes, when not to take notes, when to listen, how to listen, what are the things that you're trying to connect yourself to. And sometimes that entails with a younger student, what's it like to interrupt somebody? What's it like when you get interrupted? Why is someone else talking? Are they giving you information? Are they wasting your time? Are they just involved in pleasantries? And then how do you react in those different scenarios, right? Which then will force a different kind of question, I think, to the subject matter at hand. Say in kindergarten, you're doing the Aesop's fable, the tortoise and the hare, and that's on my mind because I just thought it was funny to do it. Right here. And so you read the fable, and you want to know some things, particularly because this has some concrete parts to it, right? Who are the characters? And your kindergartners can say, well, there was a hare and there was a tortoise. And, well, what's the difference between a hare and a rabbit? You might want to do some of those kind of things. What's a moral? Do you know that word, everybody? Can we talk about why we have Aesop's fables? Depending on your group, you can pick those kind of questions. And then, like I said, one question's you're learning how to think in questions. So one answer to your question is going to lead you to the next question. At first, you're going to be doing a lot of the questioning, in my experience anyway. And you're going to have some people who are going to give answers that are awfully bonkers. And you need to be able to have an understanding with them of how to act, how to adjust in that moment. Right? How does that change when you get to what would be like primary school, lower grammar? So that's first, second grade. those questions might be similar. They may have a little bit more complexity. As you go, your students are going to learn to listen more, and they're going to pick up on things and say, well, what about this? They're really good at saying why, right? Why, right? Or how. And use that to actually formulate a question that will lead to the next one, right? What about upper grade? Though now we're going to start getting to a little bit of maybe some different questions that are going to call a little bit more on the rhetorical that they learned younger, right? When you get to logic school and rhetoric school, you're now hopefully getting into these sort of trails that are taking you way deep in there. I have lots of other thoughts, but I want to hear some things first, if I could. Anybody who's tried Socratic dialogue or employs Socratic dialogues in the kindergarten, I want to go as young, preschool and kindergarten. Preschool, pre-K, pre-kindergarten.
A lot, oftentimes it's, with dealing with cause and effect relationships.
Oh yeah.
Asking questions about what would happen, or, trying to lead them to think the next step, so forth.
Yeah, cause and effect. That's great. This happens. When this happens, what happens next, right? And help them with that.
Yeah, this is more just what I did when they were much younger in the homeschool setting. But definitions are really where you can focus a lot, because what's the difference between a bus and a car and a train? They all have wheels, they all move, and yet they're different. And kids are fascinated with what those little nuances are, and that helps them to define, as you were talking about before, giving definitions rather than examples.
Yeah, I find that asking for definitions at all levels is very helpful. Just with the high schoolers this morning, what is good? You would have been surprised. Yeah. Okay. This is the person that I picked on. Okay, what about can first and second? Can we say third grade? First, second, third grade. Anybody going out there? Good. Yes.
Oh, I find they're very concerned about who did right in the story. If it's a story that we're talking about, is this something he should have done or something that was not okay to do?
Yeah. You are seeing the unfolding of the good and evil, right?
Oh yes.
Yeah. Is it fair? Was it right that this happened? Right. Start getting into some of those. This perhaps too is a good point that just popped in my head. And there is a different way to do Socratic dialogue when you're doing a story, and you sort of want to at least open by going through the plot, right? And you're identifying specific parts of the story that are important to understand, just what's going on and who the characters are and why this was written in the first place, versus let's talk about the theory of entropy or something like that, right? If we're going to do it Socratic dialogue with science, you're going to do it different. You're going to have a specific order in a narrative in prose or in poetry, and you're going to it's going to look like a mismatch all over the place. Example with something more like science or math. This.
I know, teaching third and fourth grade Latin, the way to get feedback and kind of get everyone working was someone tries to give the sentence in Latin that they see in a picture on the board. And we put it up on the board and I say, are there any change? Are we going to let this stand? And that's the great way to get feedback there. But I had a hard time, moving back toward, is there a correct answer? Instead it became everyone offering their things at that age. I wasn't sure how to.
Yeah. Is there another way to do this?
Yeah.
Is this the only? Yeah. The only translation. Right. Older students, bro. Oh.
Yeah, I was thinking in, say, 4th, 5th, 6th grade, when you're reciting longer pieces of literature and you're discussing the recitations that people are doing, and you want to illustrate that somebody didn't quite get it right, that their inflection was off. And you could ask questions at that point about whose inflection better captures author intent.
Yeah. That's great. Brian?
It was how do you prevent somebody from dominating the conversation when they get a little bit more interested? I see that especially in the middle school.
Yeah, that was really leading me here. At the very end of, thanks for the segment. Socratic Conversation, the layman book. He has a section here about the dialogical virtues, intellectual and moral excellence in and through Socratic conversation. And he says there are specific things that we need to insist upon. The first one is wisdom. And of course, we have this goal as classical Lutheran educators that we want our scholars to be wise unto salvation, right? The whole point is that we want to see them in heaven, okay? And wisdom, of course, we know comes in the fear of the Lord. And so part of that is the teaching of being wise. And I loved how Pastor Keyser mentioned, and was it you, the 7 liberal arts and the 6 chief parts? Is that part of the? I don't remember who sort of came up with that, but as we give the elevator speech for classical education, that we would have not just the 7 liberal arts, but the basis of our Christian life as a total 6 faceted life, right? The second thing is humility and charity. In terms, I'm going to read a few lines here. In terms of the moral virtues, humility is the foundation of Socratic conversation and is vital to its ongoing flourishing. In general, the Greeks had no clear conception of humility as a virtue, and yet anyone familiar with Plato's dialogues is aware of something like this virtue operating in the words and deeds of Plato's greatest characters. We need only remind ourselves of the character Timaeus in the dialogue named after him to see a clear instance of this. And so following the Judeo-Christian tradition, Augustine, however you prefer it, was convinced that humility was, in a sense, the foundation of all learning. He of St. Victor, sometimes called the second Augustine, explains humility as the foundation of all learning. Now the beginning of discipline is humility. Although the lessons of humility are many, the 3 which follow are of a special importance to the student. First, that he hold no knowledge and no writing in contempt. Okay, that's one here. If you're going to come to the conversation, no contempt against it. Second, that he blush to learn from no man. Well, I'm not going to participate in the conversation because he's in the conversation, right? I don't learn from him, right? Or how is it ever possible that I can learn from that person, right? We don't allow that. Okay. And third, that when he has attained learning himself, he does not look down upon everyone else. There is, I think, maybe a slight connection to what Pastor Christensen was just saying there, and that we then don't look down upon others by orating to them and then making this like public proclamation that I've just now told you everything and there's no need to continue talking anymore, right? Other indispensable moments or virtues: courage, patience, and kindness. I think part of the kindness is also to that point that we don't let any one person hog the conversation, right? Okay. There were a few general guidelines that he gives at the end here. One is avoid serial monologue, which is directly to Pastor Christensen's point there. The first one is stay on topic. That's your job as a leader. Keep everybody on the topic. Always, always, always refer to the text or the work. Okay, keep the text itself there. Now, if you're doing that with Aesop's fables, or you're doing that with, something that maybe a preschool text.
Farmer boy.
farmer boy, you want the text in front of them, right? You want the experience of the text as part of the conversation, okay? As well as you want, the Republic in front of the high schoolers. Okay? Remember your manners. And this is something that you and I have to do as teachers, right? Remember your manners. All the time, we're telling them. My friend Jason Broughton, Pastor Broughton, any of you know Pastor Broughton, just on that podcast I heard him say, a lot of my life as a father in my house is saying to my children, you should probably do that with your mouth shut. The light good teacher too. And then you are not actually part or the leader of the conversation, but you are the moderator. Yes.
So to his question and to the rules that you just, or the values that you outlined and then some guidelines, how heavy-handed do you get, or how explicit do you get about publishing or making widely known what these values are in the conversation, right? So obviously you should be modeling these things. We would all agree on this. But how much coaching, how much instruction, how much teaching do you do beforehand to say, these are the expectations. If this is going to run, right, we're going to have to agree to behave this way. So I taught Socratic seminar at the middle school level for several years. And initially, like at the beginning of the semester, at the beginning of the school year, I felt like a traffic cop, right? Just like, no, stop. No, you come on. Okay, wait. No, right? Like I was just constantly, like there was so much of that because my students did not have much practice or coaching in this. They had almost no idea what they were doing. And so they needed a ton of hand holding. But that eventually relaxed. But I was really upfront about how that's going to be. Is that your approach, or are you like more hands off and just kind of they'll figure it out?
No, I mean, I've done it both ways, and I think just letting it happen and just jumping into the chaos is much more difficult to manage and not fair to everybody at the table. Mm-hmm. And so I oftentimes will start with ground rules. Okay, this is how we're going to act. Remember, I am wanting every single person in here to be part of the conversation. I'm going to encourage you. I'm going to walk around the room and encourage you to be part of the conversation. Not any one person is going to hog the conversation. You need to remember your manners. You need to remember that this is a conversation about Farmer Boy. It's not about your ride and your bike on recess time or whatever. And just go through those things. I think the other side of that is me making sure I know what expectation I'm going to insist upon, like the back of my hand, so that I'm not, wait a minute, what's going on here? And something gets out of hand before I'm able to pull it back. Right. Now, the other thing about, I think this is important. I've tried this both ways. Having Socratic dialogue like this is not that fruitful. With all of you sitting staring in the front, and then somebody in the front meeting like this, you really have to sort of figure out how to get it so everybody can see one another. And you have to, like with middle school students, which is what I spend my majority of my life with, is I need to get rid of the distractions in front of them. There's this big stack of stuff and their pencil and they're over there in the corner going. Oh, you want me to answer something? No. Yeah, so we just put it all in the middle of the classroom, go stand or sit on stools around the edge. We all want to see each other. In Roswell and Emmanuel, I used to actually have movable tables, which I have now. I guess I could do it this way too. But we would make like big conference table and we would just all sit and we would be able to see each other and have that perfect.
What suggestions do you have to capture kind of summaries? And because otherwise what happens oftentimes is students will leave like, yeah, it was a great discussion, but by the end of the day it's like, you ask them, okay, well, what'd you discuss in history class or whatever class? It was really awesome, Mom, or it was really great, but I don't remember what, so how do you capture those? Because so much of it is oral and conversational and not even necessarily predictable ahead of time. How do you go about capturing some of those great ideas and thoughts that were produced from these Socratic dialogues?
Yeah, the first thought that pops in my head on that topic is that you have to be on your game as the moderator, and you have to be the master of this particular text, and that's going to involve a teaching component of that text to your people, right? And so there's going to be a moment where I'm going to talk about Mark's gospel, and I'm just going to lecture to them about it, and then I'm going to have them all sit in a circle and say, okay, let's talk about Mark's gospel. And well, what do you think about this? And I also don't want them taking notes on Socratic dialogue time. I don't want them worried about something in front of them. And I want to use as much of my position as teacher to excite the enthusiasm in the room so that the conversation is driving some of that too.
Sure. So what do you think about possibly as the homework assignment to jot down 1-2 things that you heard a classmate say that really resonated with you or stuck with you or something like that so that you can capture some of those things?
Yeah, I like that idea. I also was thinking when you first asked the question too about the component of narration, which is really cool. So the in-between stage between the didactic lecture day and the Socratic day, if there's a way to have them say, Amanda, will you tell me in your own words, Mark 6:1-15, that we talked about yesterday? And to force them back into that, and we could have a whole session on narration itself, but that I think is like the precursor, and then now write 2 things even maybe at the end of the class before they go home, so they don't lose it.
A masterful teacher will recognize next day, next week, where to pull that conversation forward.
Yeah, the conversation never ends, right?
It's not a vacuum.
Right. It's not, okay, put the Republic away, we'll never talk about that again. Right? That's great. That's a wonderful one. One more. You're it.
I don't want to be the last one. Thank you. If I read Farnsworth correctly on the Socratic method, he suggests that Socrates was a great deconstructionist, but was not a particularly good constructionist. There are no answers in the dialogue. He destroys every reason why it's wrong, but he never says this is why it's right. And so my red flag and my question for Socratic dialogue is, what do you think is the relationship between objective truth, which there's at least some in the Christian church that we want to get across, and the Socratic method, which seems to be, like I said, really, really good at deconstruction, but isn't always good at making sure that we get the, baptism really is, this really is Bible. Or there is a right answer that we want to make sure that they get, rather than just having to talk about it.
I think that's in an interesting spot between what Dr. Tillman just said, and that is that this is an ongoing sort of conversation, and oftentimes, months later, I talked about love and envy and hate again, and they all were like, "Oh yeah, we said envy," and they jumped back into it, right? And then the fact that you can't just, I don't believe you can do what Socrates did and only do this. We pair our work with lecturing, reading to them, tutoring, and dialogue, right? And that we're not necessarily in our circles doing exactly like Socrates, even though the process bears his name. But when there's a moment and you're like, whoa, we need to circle back to the text. Jesus actually says this, and this is the reality of our Christian life here. Now let's talk about it again, right? Redirect, pull them back to the cross.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.